Please join me in taking a big collective breath. Maybe even give a little stretch. Controlling our breath and engaging our bodies allows us to regulate our emotions, improve cognitive functioning, build social connections, and take on each moment. As we take on this moment together today, I'm reminded of the words of author and historian Howard Zinn, who said, "You can't stand still on a moving train." Public education, especially public education that serves minoritized learners, is standing still. We are not meeting the needs of 21st century students. Much like a swimmer caught in a riptide paralyzed by fear, schooling in urban centers is frozen. Or worse, doubling down, backtracking in the pursuit of assembly line efficiency through scripted curricula, standardized experiences, and over-reliance on high-stakes assessment, and a general distrust of teachers. Unless we are willing to face our fears, to swim sideways and cut a perpendicular path, public education is likely to stay stuck or drowned. So what do we do? What do we do to address academic disparities that are far too predictable by race and zip code? What do we do to meet students' social and emotional learning needs? What do we do to improve school culture and climate so that great teachers stay, new and struggling teachers can grow, and we can recruit exceptional candidates to the profession? What do we do when resources are limited, but needs are immediate and immense? Well, I'm here today to share with you one thing that we can do to contribute to meeting many of the challenges facing public education today. And that one thing is we can ensure that each young person in every public school in the United States has access to high-quality physical education and meaningful movement throughout their school day. At little or no cost, this we can do. This fall marked my 30th year in public education. I've been a teacher, a building and district level leader, a school board member, and I am currently an associate professor in the School of Education and Urban Studies at Morgan State University, a historically black college in Baltimore, Maryland. Go Bears. It is through these diverse and extensive experience in public education that I come to you today with this message. A message that it's possible, and a message that we can afford it. My first teaching experience was internationally, where I worked with young people who were learning in English while simultaneously learning English for the first time. My second role as an educator, I worked with students in special education, students with autism and those with emotional regulation challenges. These three groups of young people, my English learners, my students with neuroatypicalities, and my students with emotional challenges, all had two things in common. One, they were brilliant. And two, few could express that brilliance in a way that schools and teachers could understand. As a young teacher seeing this tension, the tension between the brilliance of my students and their lack of success in schools broke my heart. But also as a young teacher, as a young physical educator, I realized that I had the power of play. With basketball, soccer, dance, and many other movement activities, I could harness motivation and leverage the potential of high-quality physical education to support my students' success and the positive experiences they were having in schools. I define high-quality physical education as a curricular approach that exposes young people to a wide variety of movement opportunities through pedagogical practices that are academically rigorous, developmentally appropriate, culturally relevant, and trauma-informed for the joyful purpose of cultivating agency, efficacy, and habits of well-being. Let's play for just a moment. Please stand as you are able. Whether standing or sitting, please make your whole body as straight as you possibly can. It can look like the people next to you, but it doesn't have to. Then go ahead and bend half your body. Thank you. If you're not already seated, have a seat. I invite you to join me in that micro activity for three reasons. One, to ask you to consider how much more connected to this conversation and engaged to this community do you feel simply for mindfully inviting your body to join your brain for a second. 2, because hashtag real talk, who doesn't like to be bowed to by an audience of strangers? And 3, to ask you to consider how old were you when you knew how to make your whole body straight? How old is a child when they know how to bend half their body? When I pose those questions, audience consensus is usually that typically developing children between the ages of 3 and 4 know how to make their whole body straight and know how to bend half of it. Yet it is rare in public education that we formally introduce fractions before 1st or 2nd grade, thereby missing out on years of opportunity to empower young people by giving them the words to express what their bodies already knew. You see, bodies are brilliant. Children are brilliant. It is our job as educators to give young people words and ways to express that brilliance, as well as to help them cultivate new tools, including leveraging their body to build new knowledge and make new meaning. Throughout my career, I've had the opportunity to travel the country and facilitate workshops on movement-based interdisciplinary teaching and learning. Regardless of if the audience was physical educators, classroom teachers, or other content experts, I always get some version of the same response. At some point in the workshop, some brave, vulnerable soul will raise their hand and say something along the lines of, "Martha, this is great, but I could never do that with my students." Teachers across races and school types have expressed this same fear. Fear of their students. Fear of their students' bodies. Fear of their students' bodies moving. Fear that if they let them start, they won't be able to get them to stop. Fear of losing control. When we glimpse the power of physical activity, when we see a young person walking down a sidewalk, they balance on the curbs or they jump over cracks. No one told them they had to make the relatively easy transition from one place to another more challenging, but they do. And they do because human beings like challenges. Heck, maybe some of you are still tempted when you walk through a door frame to jump and see if you've still got hops. Or maybe not. Because as much as human beings like challenges, we also like challenges that are rigorous and meaningful. And now that we've been taught not to move, and we've grown, and so that doorway's a little closer, we're far less motivated to engage in that activity. But knowing that young people are motivated by rich, meaningful, challenging opportunities, what do we do with young people when they're unsuccessful on standardized assessments? Standardized assessments whose results are far more closely correlated to society's failings than they are at predicting a young person's potential to succeed. What do we do with these young people? Well, far too often we strip their educational experience of anything beautiful, of anything that moves, and instead replace that with extended seat time and redundant testing. Review most plans for educational reform and you will see the requirements for research-based best practices. Far too often, however, we only consider the implications of research to the extent that it confirms what we're already comfortable doing or ensures that publishers continue to profit. Take, for example, the research on early childhood literacy acquisition. This research has shown that young people learn best to read first thing in the morning, which has resulted in elementary schools across the United States ordaining the first 90 minutes as sacred reading time. If we were to look at this research with a little bit more courage, though, perhaps we would realize that first thing in the morning is a time when young people have recently been social and had the opportunity to move their bodies. Therefore, rather than relegating 9 to 10:30 a.m. as the time young people can learn, we could replicate opportunities for optimal learning throughout the school day. Why don't we? Well, one of the reasons is because the United States has a long and problematic history with labor. This complex and often oppressive relationship impacts our perceptions of physical activity. When I was a child in school, you could often hear teachers say that if you were not academically successful or behaviorally compliant, you were going to end up digging ditches for a living. Now, I'm not sure where all these ditches were that needed digging, but my classmates and I were encouraged to be terrified by this. Terrified by a potential future of manual labor. So whether through threat of digging ditches or otherwise, we are subtly taught that if we're truly to be successful, we will use our brains rather than being stuck relying on our bodies. a perspective that when internalized negatively impacts our interest in and ability to participate in physical activity, especially for people in minoritized bodies, thereby ensuring that capitalizing on the benefits of physical activity remain a privilege for those who are wealthy or white. If we truly want to see the success of hearts, minds, and bodies of children, the institution of schooling must evolve beyond fear. We must elevate considerations of how and why we teach things to a place of equal importance with what and when. Because after all, we can teach rugby in ways that are engaging, emancipating, and academically rigorous, just as we can teach geometry in ways that are dehumanizing, traumatizing, or trivial. High-quality physical education and interdisciplinary movement experiences center student voice, and they cultivate the development of 21st century skills. Skills such as creative thinking, collaboration, communication, persistence, and problem solving. And after all, it is a very rare child who learns to persist through hardship of life by reading really tough paragraphs. So when it comes to schools addressing the social and emotional needs of learners, we would think that physical education, along with the arts and health education, would be content areas that should be centered. Because after all, these are content areas that academic standards expressly require the teaching of skills and strategies to avoid, process, and move beyond trauma. Yet far too often, public schools, and especially public schools who serve minoritized learners, start and end their efforts to meet social and emotional learning, either with token economies or the pathologizing of young people in order to prescribe solutions delivered by medical professionals, thereby doubling down on a medical model that situates children, especially children who are Black, brown, or poor, as broken. So let me tell you a little story here. I remember the year that I divided my fifth graders into small groups. I charged each group with just coming up with something that occurred cyclically in nature. Think water cycle, life cycle of the butterfly, seasons of the year. Each group was to identify a cyclical occurrence, learn as much as they could about that occurrence, determine what the stages were, the critical elements of each stage, and then translate those critical elements into movement experiences. The final presentations were to be shared with our audience on an elevated platform in the middle of the gym at the annual science fair. The night of the event arrived. The students were terrified at realizing how exposed they were going to be in this theater of the round style presentation in the middle of the gym in front of hundreds of classmates, community, and family members. I noticed throughout the evening, though, that my student Kevin was sitting by himself. And it wasn't terribly unusual to see Kevin sitting by himself. Kevin was much taller and much, much rounder than most fifth graders. He worked really hard to manage a learning disability, and he stuttered when he spoke. So Kevin very rarely spoke. But as the night went on, I realized he was still there by himself. And it came to me later on that he was by himself because his two group members had not shown up. So as I approached him to let him know that he was off the hook and his grade wasn't going to be affected, I was not prepared for Kevin's response. Kevin looked at me with mist in his eyes and said in his very, very challenged speech, "Miss Martha, I worked really hard on this and I learned a lot. Can I go up there and dance by myself?" And he did. For the next 120 seconds, Kevin thundered across that stage as 1/3 of a storm cycle, culminating in a standing ovation. At the end of the night, Kevin's grandmother came to me and she was crying as she told me how grateful she was for that experience. She said it was the first time in his educational career that he felt like he was smart and he was good at something. Equitable access to high-quality physical education is social justice. It is justice because if realized, it would mean abundant opportunities for brilliance. It would also mean an intentionality in shifting expectations of conformity to whiteness, heteronormativity, and able-bodiedness. Centering meaningful movement in the academic days of pre-K through 21 learners would be transformative. It would mean that we as society recognize that learners of all races, ethnicities, genders, and abilities have bodies, and that those bodies are entitled to leverage physical activity as a tool for academic success and well-being. So what can you do? You can examine your bias and you can receive physical education. We can support policymakers and educational leaders in making robust, research-centered, courageous decisions on behalf of our young people. We can ensure that school leaders have the support to encourage their teachers to be excellent and understand that moving bodies in schools supports positive school climates and cultures. And we can embrace the understanding that being anti-racist means that we accept that children have bodies and that we no longer put up barriers to those bodies so that each and every child in every school in the United States has the opportunity to be brilliant. Thank you.